Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Youth for Torah, where we dig deep into God's Word to know more about Him. This week's Parasha of Shabbat that was yesterday was Parasha number 7, also called Yetze, where we can find it in Genesis 28:10 till 32:3. It continues the story of Yaakov, where he is sent to Haran in order to search for a wife. So Yaakov leaves Beersheba in verse 10 and starts his journey toward Haran. Verse 11 continues on saying that he came to a certain place. Now, the word used for certain place here in Torah is makom. This word makom is actually quite common and is used throughout the Bible. What's interesting about makom is that the root word of makom is kum, which means to rise. In other words, it's kind of like waking you up or giving you kind of like a signal for you to pay attention to what's going to happen in this moment. So when a place is mentioned, when a makom is mentioned in the Bible, it's not of little importance. We have to pay attention. It's most likely connected to something or someone important. In verse 12, we see that he falls asleep and he dreams about a ladder on which angels are going up and down. Now, this word ladder in Torah is sulam. Sulam is a special word because it is the only place in the entire Bible where it occurs, only once in the Bible. Sulam, if we analyze it with the Paleo Hebrew, the samech, as we can see here, is kind of like a hand on a staff, symbolizing a shepherd. The lamech is also a staff, but it symbolizes guidance or teaching or leading. And the mem symbolizes mayim, in other words, waters or peoples. So if we group all of those significances together, we come up with this that says, the shepherd guides the waters, in other words, the people. Now, if we think about it, the shepherd guides the people. Why is this so important? Who is our shepherd? God is our shepherd. So who is he going to guide? He's going to guide a certain people. In other words, the people of Israel later on. God is going to reveal as the shepherd how he's going to guide the nations, in particular one specific nation, in order to complete his plan of salvation. Now, if we focus on the word sulam, sulam comes from the word salal. Now, salal means to be exalted or to build up. So Yaakov, in that precise moment, was being lifted up in order to receive God's message through dreams. And in a way, it also reveals how God was going to build up a way for his people later on in the future. If we try and understand this a bit more, we can go to Isaiah 57, verses 14 through 15, that says, then he will say, keep building. In other words, salal. Clear the way, remove everything blocking my people's paths. For thus says the high, exalted one who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in the high and holy place, but also with the broken and humble, in order to revive the spirit of the humble and revive the hearts of the broken ones. We go on to see verses 13 and 15. We go on to see in verses 13 through 15 Adonai's promise and blessing for Yaakov. It says, then suddenly Adonai was standing there next to him, and he said, I am Adonai, the God of Abraham, your grandfather, and the God of Yitzhak. The land on which you are lying, I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of the dust of the earth. You will expand to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. Now pay attention to this next part. It says, by you and your descendants will the families of the earth be blessed. Look, I am with you. I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land, because I won't leave you until I have done what I have promised. Adonai again confirms the promise that he had made through Abraham, and it would be continued through his descendant Yaakov. In other words, from Yaakov was going to emerge the chosen nation of God, the nation of Israel, and they were to inherit the land on which Yaakov was sleeping. This is what God reveals as the salam that he was going to use, the sulam that he was going to use for the nations. What was the pathway? What's the way that God was going to use to bring all the nations back to him? The people of Israel. It says very clearly here, by you and your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. But how? How is it that Israel is a sulam for the nations? First of all, our beloved Messiah Yeshua. If we think about Messiah Yeshua, he is the main sulam back to Elohim. He's the main way back to God. As it is said in John 14:6, Yeshua said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So that access that we have to God is through Yeshua. And Yeshua came from Israel. Yeshua was a Jew. He came from the tribe of Judah. So this by itself is the biggest blessing ever to proceed from the nation of Israel. But that's not the only blessing that we have. The other blessing is the Jewish people themselves. The contributions that the Jews have made to the world are countless. To begin with, it's thanks to the Jews that we have our Bibles today. The Jewish scribes and scholars compiled and protected the Masoretic text in the early Middle Ages, which is considered the authoritative version of the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible. In other words, it's thanks to Jews that we have a pure and protected Bible as the ones that we have today. They did not allow it to be altered by pagan societies, so that's why we can have scripture as it was back then. That is concerning the spiritual or religious part of our lives. But also, if we think on other contributions that Jews have done for the world, let's consider, for example, the Nobel Prizes. Between 1901 and 2000, the year 2000, the Jewish people are responsible for winning 21.1% of the Nobel Prizes. Up till today, that number is even more. It's between 22 and 25% of all the Nobel Prizes that have been won. And this is quite interesting because the Jewish population compared to world population is 0.2% of the entire world population. This is based to what is about 15.7 to 15.8 million of people, which is still below the 1939 pre-Holocaust estimate. So the share of winners is 110 times their proportion of the world's population. Jews have won more Nobel Prizes than any other religious group that have won Nobel Prizes in the world. And to be a little bit more specific, Jews have won 56 Physics Nobel Prizes, 59 Medicine Nobel Prizes, 36 Chemistry Nobel Prizes, 38 Economic Nobel Prizes, 16 Literature Nobel Prizes, and 9 Peace Nobel Prizes. Aside from that, we have a ton of different Jewish figures that have impacted different areas of history, science, medical sciences, and so many other things. To mention some famous names, for example, we have Albert Einstein, who developed the theory of relativity. We have Jonas Salk, that developed the polio vaccine. Niels Bohr, that developed the study of the atomic structure. We have Baruch Blumberg, that designed the origin and spread of infectious diseases. We have Michael Dell, that's the founder of Dell, the company. We have Sergey Brin, that's a co-founder of Google, and Levi Strauss, that created a very well-known clothing company that all of us have used at some point in our lives. So that's another way that Israel has been a blessing for the entire world. Continuing on with the Torah portion, we have verse 16 that says that Jacob awakes and says, truly Adonai is in this place. Jacob goes on to describe the place as fearsome, house of God, and a gate to heaven. He sets apart a stone and he anoints the stone with oil in order to establish that as a specific landmark for that area. And he gives this place a new name called Beit El, which means house of God, after it had been originally called Luz, in other words, almond. Then Yaakov says something interesting. Verses 20 through 22, Yaakov says, Yaakov took this vow. If God will be with me and will guard me on this road that I am traveling, giving me bread to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return to my father's house in peace, then Adonai will be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a standing stone will be God's house. And of everything you give me, I will faithfully return 1/10 to you. Here, again, another revelation, another sulam is being revealed to us, that is the sulam of the priesthood, a shadow of the future priesthood of giving 1/10 back. With this, he was making a way for the future Kohanim, the Levites, that were also going to be his descendants. So now we head on to chapter 29, verses 1 to 3. It talks about Yaakov arriving at Haran, and he finds a group of shepherds with their sheep surrounding the watering place for the sheep that was covered with a stone. Yaakov inquires for Laban, and they mention that Laban is in good health and that he has his flocks nearby. While he's talking to these shepherds, all of a sudden appears a woman called Rachel, that was a shepherdess. What's interesting is that Rachel actually means a young female sheep, which goes pretty well with her job that she was a shepherdess. So Yaakov sees Rachel and they tell him this is his daughter, Rachel. So he approaches Rachel, he hugs her, he kisses her, and he helps her water the sheep. He rolls away the stone quickly and helps water Rachel's sheep and all the sheep present. This is very much like his mother Rivka. If we think about it, Rivka also did a huge work back in the day when Eliezer brought all the camels. If we remember in previous parashas, she did a whole bunch of job carrying all of that water to water all those camels. In here, Yaakov is also giving the 100%, even more of himself, to help Rachel and to help the other shepherds so that they can water their sheep. Now, it was not a simple task to remove this stone from on top of the well. Some might think that it's a small stone, but in reality, it's not. Now, the Bible doesn't mention specifically the weight of this stone, but many of biblical scholars that have visited different archaeological sites and have found these stones have given an approximate weight of what that stone could have weighed at that particular time. This stone is estimated to have weighed 136 kilos, in other words, 300 pounds. And we're talking about that weight being moved by one single person. Yaakov himself moved that amount of weight in order to help Rachel. So, from verses 15 through 20, we see that Yaakov decides to stay with Laban, and he stays with Laban for a whole month. And here we see Laban's greed as he comes up with a plan in order to take advantage of Yaakov. So, going back a little bit in time and going to previous parashas, if we remember the first time we met Laban, Laban was very attentive to Eliezer when he saw the treasures Eliezer had brought, because before that, he did not even talk to Eliezer, that was Abraham's servant. Now, in Yaakov's case, since Yaakov had left in a hurry because Esau, his brother, wanted to kill him, Yaakov did not bring a gift with him. Why was bringing a gift extremely important for an occasion such as this? This gift was none other than the bridal price that he had to pay for his wife. If we remember, Eliezer, when he went to search for Rivka for his master Yitzhak, he had taken with him a gift that is the bridal price. So Eliezer paid the bridal price in Yitzhak's place in order for Rivka to be able to marry Yitzhak. But in this case, Yaakov did not come with a gift. He did not come with the bridal price. This could be the reason why Yaakov was weeping when he saw Rachel and when he embraced her, because he could not give her the gift that he wanted to give. Now, this bridal price in Hebrew is mohar. So he could not present this mohar to Lavan for Rachel. Now, knowing that Yaakov did not have the mohar for Rachel, Laban comes up with an idea. He says, that he should in some way retribute that price in another way. So Yaakov decides to work. In other words, the mohar, instead of it being monetarily, he decides to make the mohar a service. In other words, make the bridal price a service for Lavan. Lavan decides to accept Yaakov's proposal that Yaakov was going to work for Rachel 7 years. Now, the Bible goes on to mention that Lavan had 2 daughters, the eldest called Leah and the youngest called Rachel, the one that we already met. Now, when we talk about these 2 girls, the Bible gives us a special detail about each and every one of them. Of Leah, it says that her eyes were rachot. This word rachot is often translated as weak, which makes it seem like it's a negative attribute, when in reality, it's not what it means. Rachot can be understood as soft or delicate. In other words, Leah's eyes were her best feature. She had beautiful eyes, but that was her beauty, her eyes. Rachel is described as beautiful in form and appearance. She was shapely. So in other words, she had her beauty from head to toe. And Yaakov had fallen in love with Rachel and stated that he would work 7 years for her. Now, this is another important part that we should take into consideration. First of all, we saw that Yaakov was going to pay a mohar for Rachel through service, but Yaakov states that he was going to work 7 years for Rachel. Now, 7 is an important number in the Bible because 7 is linked to a covenant. In other words, this was going to be the ketubah. The ketubah in biblical weddings that is even kept up to now into Jewish weddings, the ketubah means a covenant, an agreement, a contract. When Jewish people get married nowadays, and when people got married back then, there had to be an agreement, a contract, stating this is and this and these are the terms of the union between a man and a wife. So, by saying that he was going to work 7 years for Rachel, Yaakov was in a way signing the ketubah. He was saying, this is my covenant with you. This is my covenant for me in order to marry Rachel. So we can see that throughout this story, an actual wedding, like is what is celebrated nowadays by Jewish people, is taking place. Modern time Jewish weddings have a lot of these different parts that were celebrated back then. So the main parts, if we can state them, is the bridal price that we have already seen, the mohar, the betrothal that is done through the ketubah, that's the contract or covenant, and the feast or the celebration itself. In those times, bridal feasts or the whole wedding feast lasted for a week. But there's one aspect that is different from Jewish weddings nowadays from what it was back then. And we're going to see what's the difference in just a little bit. We see from verses 21 through 24 that the wedding feast takes place in the evening. Now, if we take into consideration this time of the day, and in those times that there wasn't any electricity or light, it was very difficult for people to see each other with that darkness that was coming upon the land. So, Yaakov did not know what was going to happen and the terrible plan that Laban had come up with. Laban decided to take advantage of Yaakov in order to earn more. So he swaps the sisters and he sends Leah first, and Yaakov did not know it was Leah, so he ends up marrying the firstborn. And in the next day, when he realizes, he goes and he starts asking Laban why he did that. We see verses 25 and on, it says, in the morning, Yaakov saw that he was with Leah, and he said to Laban, "What kind of thing is this that you've done to me? Didn't I work for you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me?" Now Laban answered, "In our place, that isn't how it's done, to give the younger daughter before the firstborn." So here we see how he starts to alter the ketubah. Since it wasn't written down, he starts saying, okay, You say you were going to work 7 years, but I also have my terms and conditions for this ketubah. First, my oldest child has to be given in marriage, and then my younger child has to be given in marriage. So he goes on by saying, finish the marriage week of this one, and we'll give you the other one also in exchange for the work you will do for me during yet another 7 years. So here is how he got another 7 years of free work, of free service from Yaakov. And this was a terrible treachery that he did toward Yaakov. Yaakov agreed to this, so he finished his week with Leah, and Lavan gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Lavan also gave to his daughter Rachel his slave girl Bilhah as her slave girl. So not only did Yaakov go in and sleep with Rachel, but he also loved Rachel more than Leah. Then he served Lavan another 7 years. So what is different between Jewish weddings nowadays and weddings back then? Nowadays, Jewish weddings have added another part of the whole tradition, that is that the Hatan, that's the groom, must see the Kala, that's the bride, before the wedding, and it is the Hatan that puts the veil on the Kala, that's the bride, because of Lavan's treachery, so that kind of story won't be repeated again. Verse 27, as we see here, Yaakov goes on and continues the week with Leah and marries Rachel. So Lavan gives both of his daughters in marriage, and as a result of Lavan's treachery, we see that not only did Yaakov and Rachel suffer, but also Leah, because she became the unloved wife. But we have a just God, we have a loving God that sees everything and does justice for his people. In verse 31, it says, Adonai saw that Leah was unloved, so he opened her womb while Rachel remained childless. Now, I want you guys to focus on the word womb. The word womb used here in the Tanakh is rechem. Rechem means womb. Now, what's interesting is that this word rechem comes from the word rachem or racham, which means mercy or compassion. So by opening Leah's womb, Adonai was showing compassion toward Leah, mercy toward Leah, giving her the opportunity to conceive first. But if we think about it, going a little bit further beyond, not only in Leah's case, but in women in general, the ability to conceive is a demonstration of God's compassion and mercy to mankind. Opening the woman's womb is like saying, I'm giving you the opportunity to continue on your legacy, continue on your life, continue on that beautiful miracle of life that I have established since the beginning. And with this, since we see this act of mercy, act of compassion, here we see the beginning of the tribes of Israel. So Leah conceives and gives birth to Yaakov's first 4 children, Reuben, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuben, she said, behold, a son, or look, a son. God has granted me a son. When she gave birth to the second-born, Shimon, that comes from Shema, or to hear, is he has heard, for Adonai had heard Leah's weeping, Adonai had heard Leah's suffering, Adonai had heard Leah's troubles. Levi, she said, now I will be joined to my husband, to join. And with her 4th son, she was utterly and extremely thankful to God. So she named him Praise, to praise. And what's interesting is that if we group the meaning of each and every one of these people together, we have, behold a son, for God has heard. He will join his people to eternal praise. So we have a son that God gives us, for he has heard our suffering and our anguish and our trials and troubles, and he will join his people, Israel, to eternal praise. Eternal, what does that mean? The everlasting kingdom with God. How did he do this? If we see 1 John 4:9, it says, This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son, behold, a Son, into the world that we might live through him. Then we see in 1 Corinthians 15:57, but thanks be to God, for he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. This is mercy beyond measure, because through Leah, God announced his plan of salvation, and it was through Leah that Messiah Yeshua would come, for Messiah came through Yehuda. He came through praise. That is extremely incredible, because not only was he showing mercy to her by opening her womb and granting her the ability to conceive first, but it was going to be through her that she was going to bring life to the whole world. Now, if we continue on with chapter 30, we see that Rachel saw that she could not have any kids. So she says in verse 1 to Yaakov, "Give me children or I will die." This expresses the belief of that day that if a woman was barren, life without children was not worth living. In verse 2, Yaakov makes an important statement. Am I in God's place? This is important for us to know because only God can decide the amount of children a person has or can have. So in verse 3, Rachel goes on to do something similar to Sarah by giving Yaakov her maidservant Bilhah. And through Bilhah, 2 more tribes are added for the tribes of Israel. We have the tribe of Dan and Naphtali. Dan means to judge and Naphtali to wrestle. What's interesting is that the one that gave the names to the kids was Rachel, not Bilhah. But the meaning of Bilhah's name means to be frightened or shy. So in a way, Bilhah was being completed, or she was being atoned for, or she was being renewed through her 2 sons, because to judge or to wrestle is completely the opposite of being frightened or shy. So they were giving Bilhah a new opportunity, for she was also a mother of the tribes of Israel. Seeing that Leah was not able to conceive anymore, Leah does the same thing her sister Rachel did and gives Yaakov Zilpah, her handmaid, and another 2 tribes more are added. We have Gad, that means fortune, and Asher, that is happy. What's interesting is that Zilpah's name means fragrant dropping, in other words, perfume. And if you think about it, perfume makes us happy, and perfume is a good fortune as well. So through Zilpah came happiness and good fortune. If we continue on with the story, in verses 14 through 15, we come across a very interesting part of the story. Verses 14 through 15 talk about a moment in where Reuben goes out to the field and finds some dudaim and brings these dudaim to his mother, Leah. Now, scripture has made it very clear that only God has the power to grant children, in other words, to open and to close the womb. But we can also see in this story how it's interesting the idea or the ideologies that people had in that time. Now, let's analyze this word dudaim a bit. Dudaim is translated in the Bible as mandrakes, but in reality, it just says flowers, unspecific flowers. We do not know if it is specifically a mandrake or not. Many people believe it's a mandrake because of the following reasons that we're going to see in a while. But the truth is, we don't know if it was exactly a mandrake or not. The word dudaim comes from the root word dud or dod. Now, dud or dod has an interesting meaning because it means to love, a lover, or a love token. Back in those times, there was a belief that dudaim, or the mandrakes, were some sort of love-producing plant. And what's interesting about the mandrakes is that it kind of has the shape or the form of a human. And since it is a root, in other words, it grows beneath the soil, in a way, it's like a tiny human that comes forth from the womb of the earth. So this symbolism could have been what led people to think that a mandrake would enable people to give birth or to conceive. In reality, now that mandrakes have been studied and have have been tested to see what their chemical components are, mandrakes contain powerful tropane alkaloids such as scopolamine, hyoscyamin, atropine, and mandragorin that have a sedative or analgesic effect. So they are not in any way aphrodisiac or they help in conception. They are more painkillers and anesthetics. But high doses of mandrakes can kill you, so do not experiment at home. This is one way to see it. But another way, and I believe that it's a more profound and more spiritual way of seeing it, is the following way. If we can see the whole situation that's going on right now, first of all, we see that Rachel cannot conceive, so she cannot have children. Leah, on the other hand, has given birth to 4 of the tribes of Israel so far. And we see that Reuben, her firstborn, found these random flowers that could or not be mandrakes, we don't know. But he finds these flowers, he picks them up, and he thinks about his mother. He hurries home and he gives it to his mom. If we think about it, at some point in our lives, as kids, we have done the same thing, be it with a flower, or with a leaf, or with a small rock, or with a bug, or with anything that we find. But sometimes, at some point in our life, when we are very small, we come to this conclusion or we come to this realization that one of the ways of showing our mother how much we love her is through a small gift. Because we don't own anything at that tender age, at that small age. But the fact of giving her something that we found pretty or interesting is a way of expressing or showing our love to our mother. It's the first steps of showing how much we care about her and how much we are thankful for all that she has given to us at that moment. So that priceless, precious moment of Reuben's first gift to his mother was exceedingly special for Leah to receive such love gift from her son, Reuben. But if we think about it, Rachel was going through a crisis of not being able to have a kid. So seeing that, she probably wanted to experience that loved gift too. She would also want to, her son, if she could have a son, to bring her something out of the demonstration of love at that tender age. So, an explanation could be that Rachel, when Rachel asks Leah for her flower sons, it's not particularly asking her for the type of plant, but asking her for that opportunity to know what it is to feel that love gift. So that's why Leah says, wasn't it enough for you just to take away my husband that now you have to take away my son's dudaim? In other words, like, you took away my husband and now you want to take this special moment away from me? But instead of getting mad, because as we know, Rachel was supposed to be the one to marry Yaakov first, Rachel recognizes this pain that Leah had as the unloved wife. So she says, okay, let's make a deal. I receive this love token so that I too can experience the love of a child, and you get to spend time with Yaakov. So in a way, there was this special moment of reconciliation between the two sisters, because Leah realized the pain and suffering that Rachel was going through because she could not bear children. And Rachel realized how difficult and how hard it is to be a woman not loved by your husband. So Rachel does the trade and gives the dudaim for Yaakov. And Adonai sees this and decides to give a blessing to both. Leah sleeps with Yaakov and she conceives. Verses 17 through 21 adds 2 more tribes and a daughter from Leah. We have Yisachar and we have Zebulun. Yisachar is he will reward, and Zebulun meaning dwelling together. Now, if we remember in the previous namings, it was in a way kind of like Leah was trying to demonstrate that she was fighting or competing against her sister, because she named her sons, the Lord has seen, the Lord has heard. Like, it's I am being exalted. I'm the one that's being listened to. I'm fortunate. I'm happy. But now it's like, no, now it's a reward. It's dwelling together. And we see that later on in verses 22 through 24, God heeds Rachel's prayer and she conceives and gives birth to Joseph. That means to add or to increase, saying, may the Lord, be it his will, increase yet another son for me. So in a way, we see through these three sons how the bond between these two sisters was healing, because Leah completed all the children that she was meant to give to Yaakov, and Rachel could finally give Yaakov a son. I think this is a personal opinion, this is not in Torah, but I think that this moment of reconciliation between the sisters was that enabled God to listen to Rachel and give her a son. He was waiting for that particular moment in order to say, okay, now that you two have gotten well together, here we'll complete your sons for you, Leah, and we will give you a son, Rachel. It's just an idea. But in the end, God was extremely merciful with both, and through them is that we have the entire people of Israel today. So, after the birth of Joseph, we see that the 14 years for which Yaakov had served Lavan were over. In other words, his job was done. That's it. So Yaakov, in verses 25 to 26, asks Lavan to let him go to his country and for him to go home with his wives and his children. And again, Lavan shows greed by saying to him, name your wages. This is exactly what he told him when Yaakov had asked for Rachel. Now, for Rachel and Leah, Yaakov had already worked 14 years. That was the contract, that was the ketubah, 14 years, and that was it. And they had reached the end of the 14 years. In other words, there was no other work to be done. That was it. Instead of being generous and thankful for all of Yaakov's free service and giving him a parting wage like, here, son, here's a gift for you, be free, go, be happy, he practically was telling Yaakov, if you want to receive something at all, you have to continue working for me. In verse 29, Yaakov kindly replies, trying to point out to Lavan how hard he had worked. Verses 30 to 34, we see that Lavan makes up his mind and says, no, if you want payment, you need to work. So Yaakov requests, okay, fine. If you want me to continue working for livestock, then let's do the following thing. I will receive all of the spotted, speckled, striped sheep, and you will receive the rest. Now, of course, in those times, there wasn't the knowledge of the lay of Mendel, but they did have knowledge of or had an idea of what was the major amount of certain types of sheep or phenotypes of sheep. Why? Because the mottled, speckled, striped sheep are a type of recessive trait. In other words, if they would only happen if a recessive lamb joins with a recessive goat. In other words, if a speckled goat mates with a speckled ewe, then we will get speckled descendants. If not, the main or dominant trait would be, and I'm sorry for the redundance, but will be the dominant form. In other words, if a brown sheep mated with a white one, we would get brown sheep. But we see how humble Yaakov is to request a recessive trait. In other words, he was asking for the smallest percentage of sheep that was available from Laban's flock. He wasn't even, because if he wanted to, he could have asked for the majority of sheep, but no, he asked for a small amount of sheep, in other words, the recessive trait. And again, we see in verses 35 to 36, Lavan tries to trick Yaakov. He removes all the streaked and spotted sheep so that Yaakov would work for free. He makes his sons grab all the speckled, spotted, striped sheep and takes them 3 days distance from Yaakov. In other words, for Yaakov to work for free and not to receive a single sheep. Then we see from verses 37 through 43 that Yaakov performs an interesting experiment. He placed peeled rods of poplar, almond, and plane and would make the strongest animals mate facing it. So when they were breeding, he would put that odd rod that was peeled, and he would take them to the threshing holes where all the strong the strong sheep would mate, and he put the rod there. As a result, Yaakov obtained streaked, speckled, and spotted sheep, but they were the stronger flock compared to Laban's flock that was weaker. Now, scripture doesn't say if God had told Yaakov specifically to do this, and this act on its own doesn't cause a direct change of genetic material. But what we can see is that through this experiment, God decides to show justice for Yaakov in response to Laban's treachery. In other words, this was kind of like an act of faith, kind of like with Gideon's fleece. Seeing Yaakov's hard work and seeing what he was doing, God decides to be merciful to Yaakov and grant him a strong flock of the type of sheep he had requested. We go on to chapter 31, verses 1 to 2, that says that Laban's sons start to murmur against Yaakov, like, oh, this Yaakov has taken away our father's flock and has stolen the best of the sheep, and they started to treat him differently. So, as we see from verses 3 and on, it says, Adonai said to Yaakov, return to the land of your ancestors, to your kinsmen. I will be with you. So Yaakov sent for Rachel and Leah and had them come to the field where his flock was. He said to them, I see by the way your father looks that he feels differently toward me than before. But the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, and that your father has belittled me and has changed my wages 10 times. Now, here in Torah, we have only heard about the 2 times that he has been tricked, one with the wives and the other with the sheep. But apart from those 2 times, there has been 8 times that Yaakov has been belittled and has been tricked by Lavan. We don't know what the other 8 were, but still, Lavan was terrible with poor Yaakov. But God did not allow him to do me any damage. Verse 8 says, if he said, the speckled will be your wages, then all the animals gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, the streaked will be your wages, then all the animals gave birth to the streaked young. Verses 9 says, this is how God has taken away your father's animals and given them to me. Verse 10, once when the animals were mating, I had a dream. I looked up, and there in front of me the male goats which mated with the females were streaked, speckled, and mottled. Then in the dream the angel of God said to me, Yaakov, and I replied, here I am. He continued on saying, raise your eyes now and look. All the male goats mating with the females are streaked, speckled, and mottled, for I have seen everything Lavan has been doing to you. I am the God of Beit El, where you anointed a standing stone with oil, where you vowed your vow to me. Now get up, get out of this land, and return to the land where you were born. So here we see the answer to what Yaakov had done with his experiment. God had heard him and decided to bless Yaakov with the streaked, speckled, and mottled sheep. But Yaakov was also given an answer by God to what he had said first when he initiated his journey. Yaakov had asked God to help him come back to his land. And that is exactly what God was saying. You anointed that stone with oil, named Beit El, and now I am recognizing that vow that you did for me. I am the God of Beit El, the place that you named, the place where you anointed a standing stone with oil, and you vowed your vow to me. In other words, I listen to everything that you say. I'm constantly there. I do not leave you alone. So now it's my answer to you. Here is your blessing, your family, and your livestock. And here's my answer to your first message or your first request. Go back home, that I'm bringing you home, not empty-handed, but full of blessing. So he tells his two wives, and here we see how that bond between the sisters has been reconciliated, not only with the previous story, but here they both agree to help their husband. They both support him completely. They say, our father has treated us terrible as well. Why would we owe him anything? We're going to help you and support you in everything that you decide to do. So, on verses 17 through 20, Yaakov flees with his household, with all of his wives, his sheep, his kids, his servants, everything. And we see that Laban and his Rachel does something interesting. We see that Rachel decides to, while they're fleeing, she goes into her father's tent and steals her father's idols. She takes the household idols, and it doesn't state why she does it, but we see with this, one thing is for certain, is that Lavan and his family were polytheists. In other words, aside from believing in God, they had other gods, or they believed in other gods. In other words, they had other customs and also other traditions. But the big question is, why did Rachel steal the idols? The Bible doesn't say particularly why Rachel stole the idols, but there have been some commentaries by rabbinic scholars like Rashi and others, or Rashbam, that mention that some of the probable causes of why Rachel stole the idols, one of them says that Rachel stole the idols in order for her father to convert. In other words, if the idols were not there, her father would recur only to God. So in a way, it was her helping her father get closer to God. Another proposal of why Rachel did this was that she thought that by taking the idols, she would be showing her father that the idols were useless. They were just simple statues, nothing that can be nothing that you can depend on. If a person could steal it or could destroy it or could make it go away, in other words, it's not a deity at all. So hopefully in that sense, her father would not pay attention to those idols and pay attention to God. That's another explanation. Another explanation that the rabbis give is that she took the idols in order for her father to be able to be susceptible to God's voice. For where there are idols, God cannot be present in that area because it's profane. So she did that in order for God to be able to talk to her father and to warn her father not to harm her husband. Those are three of the different explanations that are given by the rabbis as to why Rachel stole the idols. If one of those is true, we will only know when Yeshua comes and we get to ask him about all the different details that we don't know. But that is open for different discussions. Anyway, verses 22 through 23, Lavan didn't notice that they had left until the third day, and he decides to pursue them and pursues them for 7 days until catching up to them. In verse 24, Adonai appears to Lavan in a dream and warns him, you are not to harm Yaakov. You're not to tell him anything, either good or bad. Lavan goes on to continue lying to Yaakov and says that he wanted to say goodbye. In verses 25 to 30, it says that he wanted to say goodbye and wanted to give them a feast and let them go with trumpets and cymbals. But in reality, what he was looking for was his household idols. So he tells them, well, I've come here to talk to you, but in reality, I've come here for my idols. So he starts searching all of the camp of Yaakov. He starts grabbing all of the things and goes into every tent. He goes into Yaakov's tent. He goes into Leah's tent, the servant's tent. But when he goes into Rachel's tent, Rachel does something clever. She places the household idols underneath the saddle and sits on it. And she tells her father that she cannot get up to meet him because she is on her month, on the days where she is unclean. Now, This is quite interesting because this also shows us that Torah has been present even before Sinai, once more. Because if we remember in Leviticus 15:19 through 33, but in this particular moment, just Leviticus 15:19, it says, when a woman has a discharge consisting of blood from her body, she will be unclean due to her menstruation for 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. We see that despite being a polytheist, Lavan obeyed this rule, and in order not to become impure, he decides not to mess with Rachel at all. So we see that Lavan does not find the idols, and Yaakov gets angry and starts arguing with Lavan. In verse 38, we see that he says, I have been with you for these 20 years. In other words, he served 14 years for the 2 wives and 6 years for the flock. Your male sheep and goats haven't aborted their young, and I haven't eaten the male animals in your flocks. If one of your flock was destroyed by a wild animal, I didn't bring the carcass to you, but bore the loss myself. You demanded that I compensate you for any animal stolen, whether by day or by night. Here's how it was for me. During the day, thirst consumed me, and at night the cold. My sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I've been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you've changed my wages 10 times. Here's something interesting, verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the one whom Yitzhak fears, had not been on my side, by now you would certainly have already sent me away with nothing. God has seen how distressed I have been and how hard I've worked, and last night he passed judgment in my favor. So he was recognizing, he was showing Laban all the unjust treatment that he had received, but instead of giving himself the credit, Yaakov gives God the credit. This goes in accord with what is mentioned in John 3:27 that says, a man can receive nothing except it be given to him from heaven. In other words, everything that we receive now, all of our riches, all of our success, all of the blessings that we receive, it's not because of our own merit, but it's because God enables us to receive it. And that's what Yaakov was recognizing in front of Lavan. He's like, I worked hard, but it wasn't because of me that I have all that I have today. It was because of God. God judged between you and me, and he granted me the blessing to receive what I have nowadays. In contrast to how Yaakov behaved, Laban does the complete opposite. We see here in verse 43, Laban answers Yaakov the following way. He says, the daughters are mine, the children are mine, the flocks are mine, and everything you see is mine. He's all like, me, 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 me. But what can I do today about these daughters of mine or the children they have borne? So this reminds us of Luke 6:45. Luke 6:45 says, the good man brings good things out of the good treasure of his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil treasure of his heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. So what you say is a direct translation of what is written in your heart. If what you have on your heart is Torah and the fear of the Lord, what proceeds from your mouth will be only blessing. But if what you have in your heart is perverse and related to the evil one, what comes out of your mouth will be only disaster. So we see from verses 45 to 49 that they make a covenant. They set up a pile of stones and say that none of them would cross. Yaakov would not cross to Laban's side, and Laban would not cross to Yaakov's side in order to do harm to the other. They would respect each other, and they would respect the boundary of the pile of rocks. And here, this pile of rocks is given 2 different names. And here we can also see that 2 different languages are spoken. Yaakov spoke Hebrew, and Lavan spoke Aramaic. Lavan called it Yagar Sahudata, and Yaakov called it Galed, both meaning a pile of witness. So Lavan decides to swear by his gods and by the God of Abraham, and Yaakov swore by only one God. What's interesting is that when he says that he's going to swear by one God, he does not say, I'm going to swear by my God. Yaakov says in Genesis 31:53 that he's going to swear by the fear of his father Yitzhak. Pachad is the word. Pachad means fear, but an intense, not fear, but an intense sensation or an intense feeling of profound respect. It's interesting to see how Yaakov refers to God as the fear. This is to show that Yaakov not only believed in Elohim as the one and only true God, but that he had a high respect for God and that God posed for Yaakov as an omnipotent God, especially considering that he was making an oath. With this, he was expressing how serious he was about keeping his end of the oath and how much he respected and trusted Elohim. So, Lavan departs, and we go on to the last part of the Parasha, that's chapter 32, from verses 1 through 3. It says that Lavan leaves and Yaakov departs, and as he is departing, angels of God come to meet him. So Yaakov sees all of these angels and calls the place Machanaim. Machanaim is the plural form of Machaneh. Machaneh means camp or an army or sacred courts. Machaneh comes from the root word that's chana. Chana means to abide or to dwell. In other words, a dwelling place or to dwell with. This word machana is also mentioned in other parts of the Bible. A very famous verse where we can find this word machana is Psalm 34:7. If you are reading the complete Jewish version, it's Psalm 34:8. What is that verse? This following verse. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. This word encamps is the same word machaneh that is used here in order to describe the word machanaim. So, the angels of God literally were dwelling with Yaakov, protecting him from an evil force that in this case was Lavan. And here we see in Psalm that God says that whoever fears Adonai, Adonai has his angels to dwell with and to protect that individual or those people. In other words, those who fear Adonai are constantly being protected by Adonai's angels. Where other place in the Bible do we see this happening? We can see this happening in 2 Kings 6 verses 8 through 23 with Elisha. If we remember the story of Elisha, we see that he was in a certain place with his servant, and when they wake up in the following day, the servant starts panicking and freaking out because there was a huge army surrounding the city because they wanted to take Elisha captive and bring him back to the king of Aram. And Elisha requests that God open the servant's eyes so that he could see that there was something even bigger going on. And the servant's eyes are open so that he could see that there was a huge army of angels surrounding the whole city on chariots of fire. In other words, just for one man, there was Elisha, an army of Elohim was protecting him, and God delivered Elisha from the hand of the king of Aram. So the same is for us. If we are in constant communion with our Elohim, Elohim protects us in different ways. Perhaps we don't see it because right now we have our eyes blinded to the forces of good and evil, but that does not mean that we're alone. We are protected and we are under God's help. So with that, we have concluded the Parasha number 7, Yetze, and I pray that God may bless you with all the happiness and success that this week may have to offer you. May you have a Shavua Tov, and God willing, we will see each other next week. Shalom.